I'm Hara Marano and an editor, and I've been an editor longer than maybe some of you have been alive, but so I've learned a few tricks over the weeks and months, and I thought I'd pass them on to you. And most people, when they hear the word editor, they think, oh my God, the grammar police, that we're a bunch of humorous people out to bust them for their mistakes. And grammar is actually the least of the things that we pay attention to, or if we pay attention to it, it's way, way, way down the line, along with punctuation. So if we're not grammar police, what are we exactly? I would say that we're facilitators of thinking, of thoughts, idea architects, really maybe thought renovators, like you hire a contractor to spiff up your home. We renovate people's thoughts and make them look good. Why do we even exist? And we exist because people need us. And don't kid yourself, just about everybody needs us. So we exist because you would be utterly shocked at how inarticulate most people are, and how vague and imprecise their thinking is. And they're, as expressed in their writing. And even really well-established, highly paid experts, it's shocking how inarticulate they can be. I'm not saying that their own understanding isn't good, but in getting it out and expressing it, there are usually lots of inarticulations and lots of vagueness. And their thinking and their writing is much more approximate than it is incisive. And editors are needed because you'd be surprised at how mentally lazy people are in pulling together their thoughts and in communicating them in a way that reaches people. Think of Michelangelo carving the slaves from the marble. You could see how much thought goes into sort of planning them, looking at the whole image, planning the rough idea, and then chiseling the finer aspects and details, and the exquisite precision that goes into defining features, and bringing out what's locked into the stone, and then in his case, leaving it locked into the stone to create the enormous sense of burden that that is associated with slaves, the brilliance of it. So we all have to be Michelangelos of our own thoughts. And you'd also be shocked at how very many very smart people fail to understand or communicate. This is the big one. They fail to understand the importance or the implications of what they say. And I would say this is the biggest failing I encounter in reading people's copy that they want published, and my biggest task and my biggest challenge in editing. And sometimes you can just be shocked at how badly people write. And the problem is that most people never get honest feedback from those around them. So they don't really have an accurate idea of where their own writing and editing flaws are. And of course, if you have teenagers in the house, you never get any positive feedback, but that's a whole other story. The other thing, editors know their audience, and they know how to present information, how to get readers from here, where they are, to there, where you want them to be in what you're trying to tell them. That's another big thing. They kind of don't know where to start. So editors know their audience. They know how to present information and ideas to their particular audience. That's another thing. All audiences are different and have a different starting point for the most part. So you have to know how to bridge that gap from where you are to where the audience is, and present the information that starts where the audience is. So notice, I've talked to you about why editors are needed and a little bit about what they do. I haven't even mentioned grammar. So it's, as I said, it's way down the list. So editors don't start out on a mission to play gotcha. So we don't gain anything by making lots of changes in people's copy. And we don't, it's not a game of making changes, because I like my life to be easy. I'm not looking for challenges or difficulty, but we want things to read really, really well. And our name doesn't go on the material that we work on. We're invisible. So our job is to make other people look good, and we feel good when we make you look good. And I'm also a writer, so I have my own bylines and the things that I make my own emotional investments in, although I am always a cheerleader for the writer and the copy that I'm working on. So when I get an article to read, I sit back and I let the writer take me on the journey that he or she has set out on. There are endless ways to tell any story, even in nonfiction. And the array is limited really only by the writer's talent. And every article or book is a journey of discovery. I want nothing more than to be surprised, to be delighted, by the way it's done and by the insights that are delivered to me. So as I said, I sit down, I pick up a pen because I edit in pen, and this is my paintbrush. And I want to wind up in a different place from where I started. And it would be great. I don't always look for it, but I'm always thrilled if there's a wow in there, either in the way something is written or the way something is presented or the way the information flows, or just a piece of information that I didn't know before. So it's only if the writer fails to pull off what's promised that I start activating my pen. And there are endless ways that a story can go bad. So how are the ways it can go bad? So it can fail to deliver any new information or new perspective on old information. Not every story is telling you new information, but it's having you look at things you're familiar with in a new way. I mean, who wants to read what they already know? That's pretty boring. So a piece can fail to explain things coherently, or it can confuse the reader, or it can contradict itself. It can fail to get under the surface of the information. That is, it can lack a satisfying depth and incisiveness. I'm always looking for a depth. You want to get deep enough into a topic, and it doesn't take a lot of space necessarily. You want to get deep enough into it quickly enough so that you come out feeling like you've been somewhere and you're coming and you exit from it. And that's always a good journey to have been on. So other ways a piece can go bad, it could be all big picture and no details, or vice versa, all details and not see the forest. It can fail to develop, that is to say, it can repeat the same thing over and over again in different words, or sometimes, unfortunately, even in the same ones. It can misinterpret information. It can fail to persuade or to make its case for whatever point is trying to be made. It can bury the lead, which is the case in the example that I'm going to share with you on my screen later. So the real nugget of information that's going to get you into the story can be somewhere on the third, fourth, or fifth page, or even at the end. Or a piece can begin where it should end and end where it should begin. An article can fail by injecting the writer's personal biases or point of view in a piece that doesn't warrant that, or doesn't benefit from it. It can use impenetrable language, and it could be so dense that it just deters reading. It can talk down to readers, or it can be snide or otherwise condescending to readers, something I urge you never to do. Or it can be written in such a monotone with sentence after sentence of the same construction that it just bores the reader to death. And when it does that, generally what that does is it obscures what's important. So it not only bores the reader, but the reader has no idea why they're reading the piece. So a piece can be lifeless because the material fails to drum up curiosity, or doesn't deliver any concrete examples to make it come alive. One of the most common marginal comments that I make in copy is DDD, demonstrate, don't declare. And you'll actually see an example of that when I share my screen with you. It'll be the first thing that you'll notice. I haven't written on the copy, but it will be obvious by looking at the start of the two parallel pieces, same piece, two parallel versions of it that you'll get to see. So how else can a story go bad? The tone can be inappropriate for the topic, or a piece can tell too much of a story in other people's words. In other words, be too much quotes and not filter through the intelligence of the writer. And presumably the reason why you're reading any piece or writing any piece is because you have some intelligence to apply to a topic, and that needs to come through. So a piece can either have too many quotes from others and obscure the writer's intelligence, or it can be all the writer's point of view, and no supporting evidence from others in others' words that can add spice and liveliness to a piece. So, I mean, that's scarcely an exhaustive list of how pieces can go bad. But, you know, I remember that in the 1980s, I was on a startup of a magazine, American Health. It was the biggest, most exciting magazine startup at the time. We got shitloads of publicity. Our photos were everywhere. We had downtown offices. It was a new big deal that a magazine was moving downtown, and our offices were under construction, and there'd be pictures of us. There were about 8 of us on the staff under ladders. It was just this sexy, very exciting deal. And I came in as executive editor, and I was setting up a news department. It turned out to be, my job was to establish a very distinctive, short, punchy, witty, serious but not solemn reporting style. And I wanted most of the news pieces to be about 300 to 350 words. And I set up this reporting structure. This is before the internet, with reporters all over the world, all over the country. And that was great. And I loved setting that up. And then I'd get in story after story of 300 words that didn't have the major point in the piece. And I'd call the reporter. Yes, we used a telephone. I'd call the reporter, and the reporter would tell me the story in his or her own words. And I'd say, well, why isn't that in the article? Why isn't the reader reading that? And almost invariably, the writer would say to me, well, you said you only wanted 300 words. And I would say, well, I wanted the right 300 words. So a story can be told at any length, but at any length, you have to get at what it is that you want people to know and why it's important. And too many pieces fail at that very important project. And once again, this happens because the writer fails to get out of his or her own head. And that's why everybody needs an editor. An editor is an objective judge of what's needed to tell the story completely and well. And editors vary in how they do it, but we are all locked into an egocentric bias, and the editor is what pulls us out of that bias. I have to say that editors are trained to do it or learn to do it. There are other professions, namely psychology, where people are also trained to get out of their own egocentric bias. That's part of the training of psychology. And psychologists can be objective listeners and understanders of other people's problems because they've been trained to get over that egocentric bias. So as I said, editors vary in how they get a piece to the finish line. I always give a writer the first shot based on my very specific questions and comments. And what I'll do is I'll embed my questions in a manuscript as they arise in the copy. I'll just throw in like boldface question in parentheses so a writer can see it very easily. And I will either send it to the writer and leave it at that, or I will go over it on the phone with the writer. And I never, ever, ever tell a writer, that I'm asking for a revise. I deal with some really smart people. Some of them are actually in this Zoom conversation. And I would never deign to tell anyone to rewrite. I would simply raise a question. And here's the beauty of working with really smart people. So if I go over a piece of copy and relate all of my questions as they arise in the copy, the writer will say to me, damn, I should have thought of that. Hey, let me take it back and make a few changes. And I haven't asked for a rewrite. And if I started out asking for a rewrite, the writer would be defensive. This isn't a trick. This is just a way I find that's really honest about what I want in copy and what I want from the really smart people that I deal with day in and day out. And so the really smart people almost invariably acknowledge where they've missed the mark, or where they could do a bit better, and they feel very motivated to fix things. And by the way, the mark of a good writer is a good writer will thank the editor. And a lousy writer will somehow feel stepped upon. And I am edited. Everyone, my editor-in-chief is edited. I edit her, she edits me. But if I'm editing and there's not enough time, if we're like smack up on deadline, I will simply ask a writer a question and say, hey, don't bother revising, just shoot me a paragraph and I will plug the information in. And sometimes a writer actually fails at revision, no one here. And if a writer fails at revision, I usually make a judgment to cut my losses if the piece is so far off track, and that I judge that the writer will never get it right. And I'll just take pen in hand and metaphorically speaking, hit the computer and revise the piece with the writer's name on it, of course. So my job is making someone look good, even sometimes if they don't deserve it. So my job in editing is to do all of what I've talked about and to make a piece flow seamlessly. So from beginning to end, I want the reader pulled through a piece. I don't want the reader stopped either by the language or by the information. I want everything, the words, the language, the pacing, the tone, to pull a reader through as if it is inevitable once they start reading that they get to the end, and so that the piece feels seamless, inevitable, and at some point or other answers all of the questions that would normally arise in the mind of a reader. So anyone who's a really good, clear thinker can be a good writer. Now, what it takes to be a great writer, that's a completely different thing. To be memorable, to be great. If Bruce Lee is here, Bruce Lee is a very good writer. He has a lot of style, he's got wit. He gets inside readers' heads almost all the time. I bring him up because he's familiar to most of us at Renaissance Weekend. And his pieces are filled usually with witty detours and asides. And so he makes writing look effortless. And that's really quite a skill. And I don't have to tell Renaissance Weekenders how much hard work goes into making things look easy. I mean, that's what we all do. We all make things look easy, and we've put years of work, whether it's education or honing our craft, to do the things we do really well. So I suppose that the goal of every piece is to draw people in, um, and set out for some interesting experience, and not lose them along the way. Um, and an editor assures that all of that happens. And so, what are the things that we do to make that happen? We choose good ideas in the first place. So we have an ear to the culture and know what's happening. And the editors differ in the, I guess, in their hearing of how they hear the culture and what they hear in the culture. And in the way, how close their ear is pressed to the culture and what's going on, to know what's happening. And they differ in how good or bad they are, how good they are in picking up signals of what's happening, what's changing, what's shifting, where to look for what's shifting, where people are having problems. Those junctures are really good places for articles, at least for the kinds of articles that I like to do and that I like to commission and that I like to bring to people. So, or, you know, sometimes I just want to bring a good story to people. And the information is in the story of a person's life or their discovery of information, and ideas. And so editors know the best way to tell that story, even if the writer doesn't. And we make sure that all the needed information is there, and we supply it, even if the writer doesn't put it all in. And I find myself very often adding information. I'm plugged into a lot of information, and one of my skills happens to be in relating lots of information together. And that's what happens when you have your ear up to the culture and just have honed ways of listening to signals. So we ensure that the most important questions are asked and answered. The questions that would arise in the mind of a reader, we assure that they're answered somewhere along the way. There's no one set way of doing it. And we pace the flow of the information and the storytelling. And we use quotes from sources, but only when the quotes add something quotable. Too many people use quotes that just don't add something. You're better off telling the information straight, in interpolating it. So editors vary the sentence structure, so everything isn't in one monotone. It isn't in one declarative sentence after another. We know how and when to introduce dependent clauses. And by God, I've just used a grammatical word, dependent clause. Okay, I won't quiz you on what a dependent clause is, but they're really important in writing, and they help shift the tone, and vary the tone and the rhythm of pieces, and they're wonderful devices for slipping in information that your reader may or may not know. You know it, you're not sure whether your reader knows it. Slipping it into a dependent clause is just a fail-proof way to get the information in. So my goal as an editor also is to be serious without being solemn. Even on serious topics, I never root for solemnity. There are articles that require a quieter tone than others, a more subdued tone, but nevertheless, I make a big distinction between being serious and being solemn, and I'm almost never solemn. So one really big thing that editors do and that writers need to do is to connect every piece of information to the main point in some way or other. This is a major failing of writers, that they'll begin a discussion of something and you don't know how it relates to the topic under discussion. You're kind of left on your own as a reader to figure it out. I don't like leaving that to chance. I want people to know how each of the parts relates to the whole. There are millions of ways to do it, but it has to be done in some way. You can use your own style to do that sort of thing. So connecting one piece of information to the other, it's sort of like creating a verbal GPS system in the writing. So other things that editors are doing and what I'm doing is I'm playing off the natural rhythms of words. Sometimes I know how things should sound before I know exactly what the words are and what a piece says, because the sound should be used to also deliver some of the information and to carry the information along. Is it urgent? Is it pleasing? Is it teasing? Is it soft? I mean, the gamut. And there's no one right way. It's the writer's talent to pull that off, but it's the editor's job to make sure it's done in an appropriate, that it's done and it's done in an appropriate way. So editors vary and connect the rhythms of all the sentences. You want the sound of the piece to help do some of the heavy lifting of carrying the reader effortlessly from beginning to end. And so at the end of that, what editors do is we write hopefully smart headlines and so-called display copy that attracts readers. And so where does grammar fit into this? So grammar is usually an ally to the storytelling. There's a logic to sentence structure. You need to know when to use it, and you need to know when to strategically violate the logic of grammar. It could be done with great effect. But grammar supports the precision of expression, and but it should be invisible in the article, just used well without calling attention to itself. I'm always chiseling away at expressiveness, as sort of aiming for lapidary clarity in articles, and hopefully with words that shine. So I don't have to persuade you that good writing takes hard work. Good editing fulfills the promise of the writer's work. And it's kind of like good psychotherapy. In the end, it's you, only better. So what I'd like to do now is take a look at one piece as it came in from a writer, and that same exact piece as it went into print in Psychology Today. Okay, I'm sharing my screen. Can everybody see what's on my desktop?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see, is the gallery view here obscuring things? Or can you see everything?
Everyone can see.
Okay, so let me get to the beginning of this. And so this is a piece on early puberty. And the piece is called Ahead of Their, that the headline I put on it is Ahead of Their Time. And why early puberty is really very disturbing, and it's not disturbing just at the time of its occurrence, because sooner or later everybody catches up to everybody else with the pubertal changes. But early puberty is such a tumultuous event for the most part that it creates havoc that often has a very profound and lasting effect on individual lives. And that's what the story is about. It was about research on the topic. And if you look at the, I'm assuming your screen looks like my screen. So the piece on the left is as it came in from the writer, and it sort of starts out telling you that puberty is pretty, by the way, this was written by a doctor, a physician, and who had written a book on hormones. It raises a lot of questions, more than it answers, and it begins by saying that, you know, early puberty is pretty tumultuous. And this is a classic example to me of demonstrate, don't declare. Don't declare that it's tumultuous, demonstrate that it's tumultuous. And the first several paragraphs of the article are a story of some woman that was buried way down in the article, maybe on the 6th or 7th page, and I pulled it up, shortened it, tightened it, and made it the opening so that you come away perceiving, knowing, apprehending the tumult that early puberty creates and the lasting havoc it can wreak on the life of someone very intelligent, very self-aware, who came from a really good family and nothing else was wrong in her life before she got catapulted into early puberty. And then what I've done is in the edited piece, I've highlighted 2 things for you. And what's in boldface here is what editors call the nut graph. It's that establishing paragraph. It pulls together something exciting, tells you why you're going to read it, gives you a taste of what's ahead, hopefully drums up a little excitement about the journey that you're going to go on, and tells you why you should even devote your time to reading it. And the paragraph, that's what these 2 paragraphs are. And the paragraph with the highlight is the paragraph with the boldface was the original beginning of the story, and that paragraph and the following paragraph are the nut graph of the piece that just pull it together and hopefully propel you forward for the next 7 pages of copy. So I can leave these up, you can look at them, and I'll be happy to take any questions you have about editing, about what I do, what editors do, what they don't do, and why you hate them, or why you love them.
Feel free to unmute, and Hara can take a question from anybody who has one.
Hi, Hara. I have a question. I just finished writing a manuscript, and the very first, I went through 6 editors.
When you say the manuscript, this is of what length?
It's 85,000 words.
So it's basically a book length.
Yes, book length.
Okay.
The first editor I found had a great resume and background, and I sent her the manuscript.
So wait, you hired an independent editor to look at this? Okay.
Yes. I'm self-publishing, so this was all going to be on my own.
Okay.
She came recommended by a friend. She had a background as an editor for many decades.
Uh-huh.
And I sent her the whole manuscript to look over. She came back. She quoted me a rate of, it was around, she estimated about 40 to 50 hours to do it. Said, I'll charge 50 an hour. It all seemed reasonable. And I asked her to do a 5-page sample edit,
Right.
which I heard is
Good
standard.
idea.
She refused. She said, "Oh, I don't do that."
Oh,
And then, interestingly, a week into the project, said, "This is much more work than I thought," even though she had the entire manuscript to review.
mhm.
And I've subsequently found some people are open to doing it. Some people refuse to do a sample edit. And I'm trying to understand, is this, because I thought it was standard. Is this standard, not standard? Are people getting insulted? I've offered to pay. Some people still
Wow.
refuse to do it. What's the standard?
Honestly, I can't tell you what the standard is, but I would tell you what I would consider good practice and what other people I know do. And that is that it is more than reasonable to ask for a 4 or 5-page trial run. In fact, I would be insulted if someone didn't ask me for that, because I would feel like they need to, if they're going to make an investment in me, they need to know what I'm going to do. And it's perfectly reasonable to do. In fact, I'm not sure why the editor didn't look over more and give you beforehand a large clue of kind of maybe big things that needed to be done and maybe smaller things that needed to be done. I would not trust anyone who would refuse to put forth some sample of what they were doing, whether or not you were paying them.
Thank you. One other follow-up question. As I went through these multiple editors, some of them suggested, and I was very happy to do this, that they would, after each paragraph or two, after each chapter or two, would send me the edits I could review, we would discuss. Others, there's this other service I use, they said, absolutely not. No editor will ever want to send you anything other than the full manuscript.
That's not true at all.
Okay.
Not at all true. In fact, I mean, I can only tell you what I've done. There's a big book that's out now. It's no secret that I was the guiding editor on it. It's Transcend by Scott Barry Kaufman. And when Scott sent me, and I'm not telling any tales out of school, when Scott originally sent me the manuscript, I looked it over, gave him some thoughts. Of course, I'm not reading it completely to give him some feedback, but gave him an idea of what was needed. He and I worked together. I actually was the editor of his very first published article 11 or 12 years ago. But what I did was I fed every chapter back to him. And when I finished a chapter, it was important to do that because the changes I recommended, in some cases splitting a chapter, in some cases moving information somewhere else. I didn't yet know where, but I knew it didn't belong there. It's very vital to give to feedback, to give to a writer in process. I suspect when you were told that only the whole thing or nothing, I'm taking a crack that this was done by machine and not a human being, that it was put through some kind of editing processor and not a human being. That's just my guess.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
We have a question. Ben has his hand raised. Ben, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, yes, actually it's Marina Nelson. How are you?
Hi.
Hi. So I was curious, in which context would you say that the writer is bearing the lead versus building up to something?
I love when a writer builds up to something, but you can feel something building and you look forward to it and you hope the writer pulls it off. But bearing lead is reading a lot of kind of not moving forward information, and then the lead just isn't the vital piece of information that gets someone into an article isn't there. There's a progression. If a piece is building up to something, there should be a progression in a kind of nicely concise way to something, and that's very enjoyable. And that's, as I said, there are many ways a story can be told, and building up to something is really good, but that doesn't always work. People don't always pull it off. And sometimes people just write pages and pages of stuff without really getting to the heart of what a piece is going to be about. That's when the lead is buried.
Got it. Thank you. And if I could comment on the previous question, I'm hearing from a lot of friends who are being taken advantage of in the way the gentleman mentioned earlier, where they're being asked for sample work or sample ideas and then just being ghosted after they provide their intellectual input. So I just wonder if
I guess that's a possibility, but I don't think that I have never, ever, I only take on very special projects. Most of the people I know, they're not wasting their time. They're not out, trying to screw a writer or an editor. They're serious about getting their work done. I mean, maybe there's some lower tier of people, but by and large, an editor can tell who's serious about what they want, and you could tell by the nature of the conversation and the interaction you have that someone is serious about their project. And if worse comes to worse, you can always say, are you dealing with other people at the same time that you're talking to me? I mean, it doesn't take a lot of energy to say something like that and to put it right out on the table.
Got it. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
Pamela had a question. Do you feel comfortable asking it, Pamela?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I'm on phone and it's very loud. I'm just curious. I'm writing a memoir and I'm new to all of this, and I guess at what point do I bring in an editor? Once like the whole manuscript is written, or bringing them in on earlier? And I know we've talked a lot about like questions to assess, but I guess what's the most important thing a writer should be thinking about with the editor, like that they're an expertise in my area that I would be writing, or that I just feel like a good vibe from them? Just love any insights. And this has been so helpful. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Thank you. You're writing a memoir because, finish the sentence.
Sorry, it's so hard. I'm sorry, muting on and off of my phone is hard.
Oh, okay.
I'm writing a memoir about my empowerment journey and how I've learned to love myself. And I want to share that story of empowerment and hopefully help people realize they're not alone, and to also laugh and relate to it and learn.
So have you finished writing your story?
No.
So I would say finish writing your story, put it away for a couple of weeks, take it out again and read it and see. So you put it away for a couple of weeks. I always put my articles away for a day or two if I have the luxury of that time, and come at it with fresh eyes, and as if you are that outsider reader, and see if it does what you want it to do for another person. And it's only when it doesn't, and you feel that you've told your story, then that's when it's time to bring in an editor. But you have to have gone through it a second time, at least a second time. Writing is a very messy project. It takes a lot of time and effort to hack away at the ideas in one's head and to articulate them precisely, to impale a thought on a word. It takes a lot of hard work. So if you can do it in one pass, my hat's off to you. You may find as you go back and read it that there are parts that you want to redo. You may feel that you want to redo the whole thing. You may feel that the end is the beginning and the beginning is the end. I mean, there are endless ways to rethink what you've done. Once you see what you've thought, you don't know what you think until you've put it down. And then you have to look at it in various ways at various times to see whether you've put it all together. I would guarantee you that it will take more than 2 passes before you even bring in an editor. And if you could do it in fewer than 4 passes, my hat's off to you.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Do we have more questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay. You're muted.
Go ahead and unmute.
So I've been writing quite a bit in academic journals, which is a
Oh,
whole
I'm so sorry.
yeah, me too. Which is a whole different type of writing and editing and peer review.
It shouldn't be. It doesn't have to be.
I agree with you.
I've seen wonderful stuff in academic journals. Academic enterprise is no excuse for lack of clarity. So,
I agree with you. I agree. I now want to pivot to some more of the mainstream journals, and I was wondering if you had any tips on that.
So when you want to pivot to mainstream journals, like what and
Harvard Business Review, Forbes, Inc.
Okay, so my advice to you is read Harvard Business Review and Forbes. I mean that because that's how you get the sound, the rhythm, that's how you incorporate the flow of information and how it's done. Ruth, you're smart. You're going to read that. You're going to see how ideas are worked through, how they're introduced. You can do that on your own. And the only way you do it is by reading those publications.
So if I could just follow up, how do you recommend pitching to those journals?
I don't. You just draft the best letter you can draft. In the most pitching is a whole other. We could devote hours to pitching. And I'd be happy to talk to you one-on-one about pitching. I think pitching is really very important. And you've got to know where the end is when you pitch, because you've got to know why it's urgent. Why now? Those things have to be answered in a 2-paragraph pitch letter. And the pitch letter has to be written in the style that you're aiming for the article. So it's kind of a tall order. And it's not just having a piece of information or having something you want to say that you think people want to hear. You have to present it in a way that's going to arouse someone's curiosity, their interest, at the same time that will persuade them why you are the person to do that, that will display your writing talent and your idea facility all in 2 paragraphs. And then answer the question, why now? Because editors are always making the decision, what should I publish now? What's in the next issue or the issue after that? You want to deliver urgency with every single pitch that you make. Otherwise, maybe you'll hear from an editor in 2 months. You don't want that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
You have a question for Marina?
Hi, I have another question if nobody else is waiting. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. This is more of a psychological question. So you mentioned not to talk down to the reader, but sometimes when you have an ear to the ground and you hear problems about the culture, you want to call people out on it. And so my fallback in that case is to take a compassionate perspective and write it from a sense of compassion. But I'm encountering an issue where there are so many people that bristle when they're spoken to with compassion. So it's not effective to speak to them with compassion. It's not effective to speak down to them. They're not interested in the data. So which route do you take?
Which route do you take? The route that you should take is to not call people out on something. I don't think that's a very effective method of reaching people to begin with.
Right.
What you want to do is put out information and let people make their own decision whether or not they're measuring up to whatever it is that you're putting out. But you're never going to change anyone by calling them out, just as I'm never going to get any cooperation from a writer if I call them up and say, hey, you turned in a shitty piece of work, you need to revise it. I'm not going to get anywhere with that.
Right. And I didn't mean that I would call them out literally.
No, I understand what you're saying, but
and also for their own happiness.
Yeah, for their own happiness, but maybe you need to rethink your approach, because inherently that's condescending. It's saying, I know how to be happy better than you do, and that may be conveyed in your tone even if you don't intend it to be.
Right.
And that may be why people bristle and don't get, and you don't get the response that you're hoping for.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hara. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, Hara.